folks, welcome to another set of 8th grade science video notes. Today we're going to learn about natural selection. By the end of this video you should know what natural selection is and what the 4 factors that affect natural selection are. If you are writing down your notes, which you should, you only need to write down the light bluish green words and the golden words. So first off, what is natural selection? Natural selection is a process by which organisms that inherit beneficial traits are more likely to live long enough to reproduce and pass on those beneficial traits. Basically, natural selection states that organisms that are best fit for the environment they live in, or they have the best traits to help them survive, will live longer and pass on their traits. The 4 parts to natural selection are overproduction, where many organisms are produced at a time; genetic variation, which is the natural differences among members of a species; adaptations, which are inherited traits that are beneficial or they help the organism to survive; and selection. Those organisms that get to live long enough to reproduce are able to pass on their good traits to their offspring. And since those traits were passed on, we call those traits selected. Let's look at an example of overproduction. Fish often have the ability to produce many eggs at a time. If you remember back to that scene from Finding Nemo just before the barracuda came, where Coral and Marlin were naming their eggs, there were hundreds of eggs there in that little cave. This might be beneficial because, if you think about it, if you're laying 1,000 eggs, there's probably a pretty good chance that one of them is going to survive. And then you've accomplished your goal in life. You've passed on your traits to your offspring. If fish only laid 1 or 2 eggs at a time, there's much less of a chance of both of those offspring surviving. Also, the more eggs they have, the more likely that there's differences among those eggs. So we increase the amount of variation among that population. This means that some of those fish could have better traits than others. Downside to this, though, is if all 1,000 of those eggs happen to survive, then there'd be quite a strain on the food supply in that area. There's a whole bunch of extra mouths to feed now. This leads to competition between that fish species and maybe another fish species or another fish family. And there's less food for everybody to eat. So it's harder for other organisms to survive. We have 2 examples for genetic variation. The first one is bacteria. So you've already learned that bacteria reproduces through binary fission. That's a type of asexual reproduction. And if you learn that lesson well enough, once I say asexual reproduction, you should automatically think, well, all the offspring are exactly the same. And that's a totally valid conclusion that you would come up with at this point in your learning. Unfortunately, you wouldn't be exactly right. So remember that bacteria are prokaryotes. That means they don't have a nucleus. And since they don't have a nucleus, the binary fission process, the reproduction process, doesn't involve mitosis at all, like the other types of asexual reproduction. So since there's no mitosis process happening, the copying of the DNA and the splitting of the DNA tends to be a little bit messier than it does with most types of asexual reproduction. So when the bacteria is splitting itself apart and making new bacteria, there tends to be a chance of genetic mutation, or the DNA doesn't spit out just right. And that could lead to some of the bacteria gaining a resistance to antibiotics. So maybe their genes are mutated just enough to where they're strong enough to resist antibiotics, which are supposed to kill bacteria. Those bacteria that don't get that mutation in their genes, they end up dying off when an antibiotic is present. Then that mutated bacteria can survive and then pass on its traits later on. Our second example is the jaguar. The jaguar, like most animals, eats with its mouth. So if jaguars are born with different sized jaws, they might be able to eat different types of food. So a jaguar that's born with a larger jaw might be able to eat hard-shelled reptiles, like a turtle. They can break the turtle's shell and then eat the turtle's meat inside. If for some reason there's a lack of food around and turtles are the only food to eat, then the jaguars with smaller mouths that can't break the turtle's shell, they're not going to have any food. So having different sized jaws is an example of genetic variation. Next, we'll look at an example of adaptations. Remember, adaptations are just traits that are good. So they're beneficial traits that help an organism to survive. One of these adaptations that we see in nature a lot is camouflage. So if you think about a fish, often the top side of the fish is much darker than the bottom side of the fish. When a predator, like a bird, is sitting on top of the water looking down, you probably know this from experience. If you look into a pond, it's usually kind of a dark, greenish, murky looking color. And you won't be able to see that fish very well because that fish is dark on top and he blends in with the water. If you're a much larger fish swimming on the bottom of the pond and you're looking up, again, you might know this from experience, maybe when you're swimming in a pool and you look up, it's pretty bright, especially when the sun is out. So when the larger fish on the bottom, that predator, is looking upwards, so when you have a predator on the bottom looking up, you want to have a much lighter belly so that you blend in with the sunlight and all of the brightness that you get when you look up into the surface of the water. So having this camouflage allows the fish to be less likely to be eaten by predators because the predators can't see them very well. That makes this trait advantageous or beneficial. It helps the fish to survive, and that's what makes it an adaptation. Now, if we look at selection, we'll go back to our bacteria and jaguars examples. With the bacteria, the job of an antibiotic is to kill bacteria. So when an antibiotic is present, often the bacteria dies. If that bacteria is mutated enough to withstand the antibiotics, it can reproduce and create new bacteria that is resistant to the antibiotics. This leads to those traits being selected or passed on to the next generation. Here's a short video clip of exactly that happening.
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, pour some thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads, until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
Now, if we think back to the jaguars, about 11,000 years ago, jaguars very nearly went extinct. There was a food shortage, and the only thing to eat was turtles. So basically, some of those jaguars, through genetic variation, had larger jaws than their brothers or sisters, and they were able to break into the turtle's shell and eat its meat. This allowed those larger jawed jaguars to survive, and they could reproduce with each other and pass on that large jaw trait. The fact that that large jaw was passed on from parent to offspring into the next generation, we would consider that trait to be selective. So to summarize the whole idea of natural selection, let's look at a population of mice. So we've got this lighter tan-colored population of mice that live on a volcanic island with very light tan-colored sandy beaches. They're able to thrive on the beach because they can't be seen very well from the birds flying by to try to find them and eat them. If they don't move, they blend in with the sand just fine. Unfortunately, due to climate change, the sea levels have been rising. This has pushed that tan population of mice inland, closer to the middle of the island, where most of the ground is a dark lava rock, and they stick out like a sore thumb. So luckily, mice can reproduce fairly quickly, and they undergo a period of overproduction where they produce a whole bunch of mice at once. And while they're producing all of these mice so quickly, we end up with a whole bunch of different traits. Due to the natural effects of genetic variation, while most of our population of mice are still tan, there's a handful of them that end up with black fur. These black-furred mice blend in with their new environment, with the lava rock, since the lava rock is a darker color. And the birds can't see them very well from up above. Unfortunately, most of the tan-furred mice get eaten by the birds because, again, now they stick out like a sore thumb. So the birds are able to see the tan-colored mice, they eat the tan-colored mice, and all that's left is the black-colored mice. Having black fur helped those mice to survive, whereas not having black fur helped the other mice to die. So black fur in this case would be an adaptation. When those mice reproduce, they're likely to pass on their black fur to their offspring. Some of them might end up with tan-furred babies and they get eaten up by the birds, but most of the population will now be black fur. Since that black fur is passed on to the next generation, it's considered a selected trait. Eventually, after many generations of this, the species ends up all black mice. And this is an example of evolution. So those mice were able to evolve to fit into their environment over many generations. Well, that's it for today, folks. Hopefully you're now able to fully explain what natural selection is and describe the 4 factors that can affect natural selection.